felt a presence, like somebody was standing there. And he wakes up and here's this massive thing standing over him. And as soon as he opened his eyes, this thing grabs him and starts throwing him around the room like a rag doll. I'm William Jevning. I'm an author. I published 9 books so far on the subject of Bigfoot. I got my start really when I was 14 back in 1972 when a buddy of mine and I found some tracks in the snow. We didn't know what they were, never heard the word Bigfoot until another friend's dad came back with us to the prints and started taking pictures and told us what he thought they were. Of course, we thought that was pretty amazing. You know, we were kids, there's monsters out in the woods. So we went looking for every weekend, never saw another thing. So, you know, when you're that age, you forget things pretty quickly. And 2 years later, when I was 16, my dog was barking like crazy one evening right at dusk. And I went out and I thought, well, you know, my dad always told me to shoot anything that comes in the yard. There was lots of raccoons and skunks and things like that. I mean, even elk would come down and eat with the cattle. So um, I took the 22 and my dog. I said, go out there and get him. I'm thinking, you know, some small animal. So I had a 22 and a couple of bullets. And he gets out to the tree line and he stops. And that dog never stopped for anything. Um, and then he stood there with his ears and tail up. And he come running back past me really fast and never stopped. And I thought, what the heck is that guy doing? You know? So I walk up to the tree line and I'm thinking, now he'd gotten into a porcupine pretty bad. So I'm thinking, well, maybe the porcupine's there. Maybe he learned his lesson. He'd stop charging into the woods at things. And I hear something moving. So I thought, okay, chambered around and there were some low hanging tree limbs. So I had to push my way through those to get into this. There was a big open area under a really big maple tree in there. And this was probably October because all the leaves were off the trees, but the fir trees covered everything. And as I entered that area under the maple tree, about 20 feet or less in front of me was this massive creature. And it was standing there moving leaves around with its right foot. And, you know, of course, a million things go through your mind in just a split second. And then it dawned on me, oh, that must be one of the things that made the footprints we found in the snow 2 years before. And it saw me and it stopped and I stopped. And I thought, you know, how am I going to get out of this one? So I thought, well, maybe if I shoot in the air, it'll scare it off. And I shot, it didn't move. Then from my right rear, I hear a noise behind some brush and out comes another one. And it walks over and stands next to the first one. And I took off and I did what the dog did. I took off running. So we'd been made fun of by everybody in my family for finding the footprints. Now, you know, you're 14, you find something, and you come back excited, you want to tell everybody. And when they make fun of you for it, then you don't want to talk about it anymore. So I didn't mention this. I called my friend John, and we decided to go out at first light the next morning. We track these footprints to see if we could find. I mean, I don't know what we thought we were going to do, but we brought our hunting rifles and there were 5 of us, and we tracked them for hours in the frost till the sun came out and melted the track. So we never talked about it openly. A friend of ours overheard us talking on the activities bus one night. There was maybe 6 kids on the bus. You know, we'd stay after and play basketball and baseball and things like that. And he overheard us talking, and he come over and sat next to us, and he said, "Well, can I interview you about this?" And I thought, well, you know, Jim's a nice kid. He doesn't have any friends, pretty introverted. I thought, well, it'll never go anywhere. So I told him. Never, and maybe 2 weeks later, he brought me some books written by John Green. And I thought, wow, I didn't know there was anything written about this stuff. So I pored over the books for the next couple of months and didn't think anything more about it. So that summer, this would have been probably late July, early August, 1975. I was sleeping for some reason uh, in my room, and one of my sisters came and said, "Hey, there's a man here to see you, a couple of men here to see you." And I'm thinking, I don't know any men. What are you talking about? So groggily, I slip on my barn boots and I go out the back door. Our driveway came around to the back of the house. And from John Green's books, here's Renee DeHenden standing there. And I, you know, back in those days, if anybody was in a book, they were famous automatically. So I'm thinking, wow, how do you know where I was at? And, you know, and to come to see me and everything. So he told me he and Green and some others were just a few miles north of us. There was an incident called the Puyallup Screamer going on at that time. And they were down from Canada investigating that. So um, we talked about the things I'd seen, and he says, "Hey, you should come up to the camp and meet Green and some of the other people up there." And he told me how to get there, so I said, "Okay." And I called a friend of mine that had a car, and we drove up there and spent a few days with those guys, and that's how I got my start in all this. They wanted to stay friends and me to be their eyes and ears in the area.
So what did that lead to? Did you discover anything by being their eyes and ears?
Oh, well, my buddies and I, of course, I was fired up about this, and I was kind of the leader of the group. So there were about 10 of us in our group of friends. And when we started school, a month later, we all sat around and I said, look, we lived in kind of an area where it was very rural. So everybody was kind of scattered out away from where the high school was. And so in kind of a big circular area. So I said, well, has anybody heard of anything weird in your area? One of the guys who lived out on the other side of Fort Lewis said, yeah, there's been some stuff going on out at the Clark Ranch, some kind of screaming. So I said, well, why don't you talk to them, see if they'll give us permission to go out there and snoop around? So he did, and they said it was okay. So we went out there, and we got surrounded by a group of these things that night, and it was terrifying. Only one of the guys saw one of the creatures, but they screamed and surrounded us. One guy was actually grabbed and partially pulled out of the tent. Um, we found the footprints. It was insane the whole night. But through snooping around, and asking questions, we did find that were things. In fact, to this day, I still have people contacting me from the area I grew up in, saying, we heard your podcast, and we did see things out, and oftentimes it'd be within 5 miles of where our home was.
Well, what did you do with this information then as you collected this knowledge and people were telling you these experiences that they had also had? Where did that travel to?
Oh, I jotted everything down and sent it to John Green. But, I went in the Army right after high school, and I was in Europe for a couple of years, and then I came back to Fort Lewis. And I kind of resumed things a little bit as I had time. I was a sergeant then, so I didn't have a lot of time, because you're a supervisor. So I was supervising a 15-man squad, and that eats up a lot of your time. But I did get information that would come in, and even well before then, I guess November '76, when we were in our senior year of high school, we went to a contact that John Green had, a college student in Portland, Oregon. He called me, and apparently he was writing some kind of a paper and on Bigfoot and wanted to talk to a few witnesses. So I was one of them that Green recommended he talk to. So we talked, and then he says, "Have you ever been to um, the location of the attack the miners had in 1924 at Mount St. Helens?" And I said, "Well, no. My dad and uncle and I hunted elk on the west side of Mount St. Helens, but I'd never been on the other side of the mountain." So he told me how to get there. And he says, "You really should go there. We were there recently." And so we went there, and we did find a line of tracks in the pumice. And one of my friends took pictures of them. And John Green, Green and DeHenden, they were the world experts at their time, but they had kind of very narrow vision when it came to the topic. And I asked a lot of questions, and they would kind of divert me away from those questions, like diet and behaviors and things like that. Um, so I would send pictures to John Green of footprints, really good footprints, and he would write back, and he'd say, "Oh yeah, those are great tracks. Did you take it with a flash?" And that would be the end of it. We never hear any more about it. So on the Clark Ranch thing, Green called me. Oh geez, I just got home from school. He was in Seattle. He says, "Hey, I'm coming down your way. Can you take me out to the Clark Ranch?" I said, "Sure." So I called two of my friends, and he picked us all up, and we went out there. And no sooner than we'd gotten out of his van, right at dusk, then and the Clark family was out there, and all this screaming, loud screaming, went on. It just went on and on and on. And we're all kind of standing, and it was funny. You could just see the silhouettes against the sky of everybody there, and nobody said anything. Then Green says, Well, I need to get back to British Columbia, so we all got in the van. He dropped us all off. We never heard another word. And then 20 years later, I was at Green's house, and he says, I've been kicking myself all these years for not taking a recorder to the Clark Ranch. And it was like that all the time with Green. So after a while, I got kind of disillusioned with those guys, and I thought, I'm going to go off and just do my own research, collect my own materials, and just follow the evidence and see where it goes.
So, where did you start doing that? Did you begin just right there at your back door, or did you venture out beyond that?
Well, after I got out of the Army in the mid 80s, I moved to Vancouver, Washington, and I was going through, divorce and a bunch of other stuff at the time. And it just, a friend of mine there said, "Hey, why don't you come down here and stay for a while? Get away from everything, clear your mind. If you like it here, stay." So I went there and I loved the area. It was a small area at the time, people wise. So I decided to stay. And a girlfriend that I had at the time, we were sitting around talking one evening. She says, it's great that you spend so much time with me and the kids, but you must have something you'd like to do for yourself. And I thought, do I tell her and you maybe ruin this or, you know? So I just blurted out. I told her what I had done as kind of a hobby. She says, "Oh, that's really interesting. You should get back into doing that." So I created with a guy a flyer with the guy that I worked with. His dad had a business. In those days, there weren't a lot of copy machines around, so um, we printed up about 1,000 of these flyers. Asking if anybody had ever seen the creatures and all that. And her son and another kid run around their bikes around Vancouver, and I put them under the windshield wipers of cars. and and it's funny how small things lead to big things. And I didn't really get any responses except from the next town over in the Columbia River Gorge. The editor of the newspaper there called me and he says, "Well, I'd like to do an interview with you." I said, "Okay." Now, I'd never talked to anybody in the media or anything like that before. I was just kind of getting my feet wet in all this. And, from when I was a teenager. So he came over, did a big 2-page spread, and his photographer had grown up in the area. So he took me around and showed me all the places where people had had sightings that were never reported. So that's where I started, kind of in the Washougal River area of southwestern Washington. And I actually had, let's see, so by 1988, we had a second sighting up in that area in the river. We'd been finding tracks up at the snow line, and I wanted to go up on this one particular day because the snow was melting pretty fast, and I thought I wanted to see if we could find more prints up there before the snow was gone for the year. So we were driving up there, and I remember the Washougal River was beautiful. It was kind of this really clear blue green color, just gorgeous color of water on bedrock. And I remember kind of glancing at it, and we had a car full of people, and everybody was looking, and I'm just kind of daydreaming in my mind about the water, thinking about a river that I fished as a kid by Mount Rainier. It looked the same. And then I saw some movement just across the water from us, maybe 50 to 75 feet away. And here's this massive gray colored Sasquatch there. And it just took 2 steps off into the brush, grabbed a tree, and off it went. And I slammed on the brakes and I said, "Don't say anything to each other. Everybody sketch what you just saw." And everybody saw it except for my girlfriend. She was looking down at the book. Everybody drew exactly the same thing. So because you're sort of in your mind thinking, did we really see that? Because it happened so quickly, but everybody did see it. Um, so that's how I started working that region. And I mean, it just blossomed. And then, of course, Green and DeHinden, I wrote both of them and told them I was there, and they were both excited. They said, "You're the first real Sasquatch hunter in that part of the state since Roger Patterson." And I thought, wow, I'm filling some big shoes here. So things just kind of mushroomed out from there.
Well, tell me about some of the topics in your books that you focused on the most.
Well, each book is of course different. The first one is sort of a general. Um, I wouldn't call it a beginner's book, but it's sort of, it could fill that role. But it covers kind of the general topic. The second book is sort of my entry into the topic. It's In Search of the Unknown. It covers about the first 10 years. of my interest, because people would ask me questions and I'd have to tell them over and over again. Now I can say, okay, well, here, buy the book and you can get all those answers. The third book was, well, I call it Haunted Valley. And that was one of the longest investigations that we did. I had my team in a place called Yakult in Southwest Washington back in 89 and 90. And it was just a long, ongoing, just tons of activity focused on this one farm. And so that's what that one's about. And then I did Witness of the Unknown, Volume 1 and 2. And those are people often write their experiences and mail them to me or email them to me. And I use those. They're kind of in their words kinds of books. I wrote a book called Bigfoot Fieldwork 101, and that's for people who are interested in the topic to, it gives them a foundation of how to actually go out and do work, because nobody ever told me how to do it. It was all trial and error. In fact, the first time I plaster cast footprints, I had a really good set of 15-inch tracks. Nobody told me how to take them out of the soil, and I broke them all to heck. So I wasn't a happy camper about that. So I had to learn how to do all that stuff on my own. Um, let's see. I did one on the Minnesota Iceman because a lot of that information is out there in the public in different pieces. I put it all together, plus new information that I got from people contacting me that had never been out before. Um, I did one called Bigfoot Evidence, and a friend of mine is a retired judge, so we were discussing how everybody says, well, there's no evidence to prove Bigfoot is real. And he says, that's total baloney. He says if it went into a court of law and you use the federal rules of evidence, much of this stuff would be considered actual evidence. You could try a case with it. And he said, like with the Patterson film, you've got two eyewitnesses, you've got a film, and physical evidence in the way of footprints. He said that would be a slam dunk in a court. So the book is it's based on that premise, entering evidence into a court situation, a fictional court situation, and then outlining exactly what the evidence is. The most recent one I did was my people have been pestering me to do a field guide, and I call it the Bigfoot Survival Guide. And that's my favorite one of the whole bunch that I've written.
Well, I like that idea that in a court of law it could be proven, but yet in the court of public opinion, it's still hanging there in the air as something that's very skeptical. I think changing the public mind's opinion is a slow process. In your book, what kind of evidence did you cover there?
Oh boy, I don't have it with me. I get all packed up. But okay, so we talk about the first one, and it's interesting because everybody says, well, eyewitness testimony doesn't mean anything. In my podcast, I've got hundreds of witness interviews that I've done so far. I've got about 650 shows that I've posted. They're not all witness interviews, but a large portion of them are. Um, but witness testimony, eyewitness testimony, when you look at it from the legal system, they lock people up every day based on nothing more than eyewitness testimony. Even the death penalty can be given to people based on nothing but eyewitness testimony. So, you know, uh, when somebody sees something and people say, "Well, you didn't see that," I have to say, "Well, were you there? How do you know what that person saw?" I do try to pick things apart a little bit because human mind does. My education is in psychology, so you do kind of have to look at things from the things a brain can create, um, as opposed, because a human, if their senses are overwhelmed that much, they can actually add or detract details from things that they actually see. So I kind of have to go through that. But, and of course, physical evidence in a way, footprints is the big one. And I've got probably thousands of pictures of footprints in my collection. But we have territorial markings, there's bedding, there's scat, um, of course, vocalizations, lots of those. Handprints. I don't do a lot with hair. You can't really do a whole lot with hair. I mean, um, DNA, the best DNA test, and I'll tell you a story. A friend of mine's a chief police in Texas. And before he took that position, he was a cop in southern New Mexico. And one of his friends was a deputy sheriff of the county. And there was a sighting where this 15-year-old kid was riding. He stayed at his friend's house too late one night and was riding his bike home. And there weren't many in that area. There's not many streetlights because the county doesn't have a lot of money to put them out there. So they're at strategic points where it's a safety hazard. So the kid felt he was being followed, and he stopped under the first streetlight he came to, and he turned around and looked, and here's this massive creature behind him. He said it was on all fours and it was already 6 feet high. So, of course, you can imagine his reaction. He tried taking off. The thing reached out, grabbed his bike. The kid went flying over the handlebars, got up, and took off running. And when he got home, of course, he was hysterical. His parents thought he was making stuff up because he was late. And he says, call the police. So they did call the police. And the sheriff comes out. This deputy did. And the deputy's like, well, I'm not really believing you. And the kid says, look, I'll take you out there and show you. So he did. They found the kid's bike. The frame was bent. It had been thrown 15 feet up into a pecan tree. And I've been to the location. I photographed a lot of stuff there. So the deputy and my buddy, who was a cop, they drove out in the deputy's cruiser to the location one night, a couple nights after this. And I'm sitting on my bed watching TV, and I'm texting both these guys at the same time. And they saw 8 sets of eyes with the spotlight. And then apparently the alpha of the group came right up behind the police cruiser and roared, causing the deputy to wet all over himself. And they're in a panic. And I told him, I said, get out of there, go get the poor deputy changed, go to Denny's or someplace, get some coffee. You guys need to calm down. So that these kind of things go on. I kind of privy to a lot of that kind of information. So uh, I'm not quite sure where I was going with all that. Oh, I know. So the deputy had actually, when he went back and took the bike down, there was some blood on it. And apparently the creature had cut its hand grabbing part of the bike or bending it. And so this began, it was actually the full chain of custody situation, where a police official collected the blood evidence and he sent it to one of their regional labs. And they at the time they called it like a $20 test. It was just to run it through the system to see if it belonged to anybody that was in the police system, right? They didn't hear anything for a year, and then all of a sudden the sheriff calls this deputy into his office and he says, why are we being charged $40,000 for this test? And he says, what do you mean? That was only supposed to be the cheap one. So apparently somebody at the lab made a mistake, and they ran the full test on it, but all that came back was unknown primate. And I've spoken to university professors who deal with DNA. In fact, my first book, I have a section in there about that from a professor in Canada who specialized in DNA and explained how that works. So, lots of people in the Bigfoot community, quote unquote, they like to jump on things like DNA and hair and all this stuff. And to me, it's kind of pointless. I mean, there are better forms of evidence. I've got, pictures. Yes, Dehendon told me one time. Renee and I became very good friends for many years, and we'd sit around and talk at his house, and he'd say, you could have one clear picture or 1,000. As long as you get somebody out there saying, I don't believe it, that's the way it is. And back with these silly conferences they do now, the whole idea of conferences originally were people like Green and Dehendon. Renee was really the first pioneer of the topic. He's the one that got everybody interested, people like John Green and Bob Titmus and Grover Krantz, those kind of guys. Those guys, they weren't out to prove the things were real. What they wanted to do was to gather enough material to get the scientific community going on it. And then they were just going to go back to their normal lives. And the first conference or two, they tried to do that. It didn't work. So now all these people today, they pick this stuff up, and it's more about, well, I'm an expert because I got this, or I'm an expert because I got that. It's more about showmanship than it is actual doing something with it. So that's the reason I don't attend those things, because um, I just don't play into that stuff. I'm more about doing the work and, seeing where it leads.
Of course. There is quite a bit out there right now, but they're again getting the public to look at it, to see it.
Hmm.
And the DNA information, like you said, it's a complicated process. It's difficult to really do anything that is um, absolute with it. And can you explain that a little bit more? Why the DNA is a problematic issue with evidence?
I think a lot of people have the wrong ideas about DNA and how that works. They think it's some magic thing. You just plug it into the system and then it spits out the answer. It's only as good as the information that scientists put into it. In other words, we've studied ourselves and dogs and other animals a lot. So there's a lot of material on those kind of species. An unknown species that doesn't have any representation, all they're going to do is bring, it'll be the closest comparison. So in that case, unknown primate is the best it could do. So any DNA evidence is that's all you're going to get from it.
So if
It's
you had,
interesting.
go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting, but it doesn't really do much for you, to be honest.
So if you had a body or more than one body that was a Bigfoot body, and you were able to gather from various bodies and then do something more conclusive, then you would have something, but otherwise you just don't.
Right. And it's people will say, "Oh, well, we shouldn't kill them. They might be endangered. There's not that many." Well, that's not true. And a friend of mine, who is a forensic anthropologist, in fact, he used to teach here in the Bay Area of California and worked the court systems for many years. Who's in Arkansas now, but he told me we talked once about this particular topic, and he says, he says science does it all the time. You bring one in on the slab, you do all this stuff with it, and you've got it proven. Um, and then I can tell you from my own work, the past 2 or 3 years, we've seen more juvenile prints than ever before. It used to be you wouldn't see juvenile was extremely rare to find tracks of. Now, um, I couldn't tell you how many pictures I have of footprints, juvenile footprints, and actual picture of a juvenile in my files. It's just, and it's exploded. People would say before, well, logging was bad because it did A, B, and C. What logging did, now logging or wildfires does an interesting thing in the forest, at least here in the Northwest. Within a year, everything is in those areas is full of lush, leafy plants. Those areas regenerate very quickly. Um, and what that does is it makes the animal populations that eat that stuff proliferate. So there's, in fact, I think Washington State's uh, wildlife site calls the deer there an infestation because there's too many of them. So when you have animals that eat that stuff, population proliferate. The animals that eat those also expand exponentially accordingly. So that's why we're seeing so many juveniles that their populations exploded.
Well, I hadn't thought of it that way. Of course, that would make some difference. So do you think it's primarily just in that area where there are these wildfires, or do you think that's happening all over?
It's all over because the anthropologist that I have on my podcast, she lives in West Texas. She actually has them on her ranch. Uh, it's funny because we've recorded a couple of times, and we'll be recording, for various shows that we do. I do 6 shows a week, different shows, and she'll say, "Guys, you got to excuse me a minute. The horses got out. I got to go get them. So, we'll take a break." And then she has literally walked out the door with the horses coming from wherever it is they got out towards her, and she's found footprints right there and taken photographs and sent it to us. And then, of course, the horses come along and wipe everything out. But and this has happened 2 or 3 times. And she actually had one get into her house one night when she was sleeping and dropped a can of beans on her head. Um, her and the gal who does work for her on her ranch, um, they come driving back from, I believe, a store one night, and they saw a juvenile squatted down in the middle of the road right in front of them. So, um,
Well, let's go
I,
back to this dropping a can of beans on her head. Now that is unbelievable. That's
we
unreal.
we we
So
tease her
tell me,
about it.
tell me how did she know it was a Bigfoot? Did she see the Bigfoot or how did she know?
No, she didn't, but when you start reducing the variables, um, you're kind of out of options. I mean, she lives out in the middle of nowhere, and the creatures are constantly at her house, doing different things, hitting the house, or I'll be out the window, or right on the porch. Um, so she said, and this is from somebody that's a fully qualified anthropologist, making this observation, and she's pretty pragmatic. She says it had to be one of the younger ones that came into the house and was fooling around with stuff, and apparently she doesn't think it threw it at her, but she think it probably fumbled and dropped it on her head while she was sleeping.
Do
But
you
now
think,
we do.
does
I'm
she
sorry, go
think
ahead.
they've been in her house before or since, or was this a one-time occurrence?
She thinks it's possible they've been in there before. Now I can tell you another story, and this is from my police chief buddy. One of his friends who's deceased now. Um, he got a call from the hospital there, from this guy named John, and so he went to see him. He wanted to find out what he was in the hospital for, and he said the guy was beat up pretty bad. He was a big guy, was beat up pretty bad, missing a finger. So he told him the story was now, and there was a little story that kind of leads up to this one, where he was out on his ranch, watering his tomatoes one day with a hose, and here come one of these creatures just waltzing right by him. So out of, I guess, instinct, he sprays the creature with the hose, and it takes off running. And he thought, that's pretty bizarre. And he didn't, and I don't know if he knew the creatures were in the area or not. I'm not sure what the background of that was, but so he had to go away on a business trip for about a month, and he came back and was sleeping. He was tired from the trip, so he decided to take a nap. So he wakes up later, and I guess he felt the presence, like somebody was standing there. And he wakes up and here's this massive thing standing over him. And as soon as he opened his eyes, this thing grabs him and starts throwing him around the room like a rag doll. And like I said, he was a big guy, 6'2", 6'3". He tried fighting back. And at one point during the melee, he got his hand near the creature's mouth and it bit one of his fingers off. And then it slammed him in the wall and knocked him out. So um, I don't recall if he called the police or how he ended up in the hospital. I think he did call the police. But my buddy went there and he said the house was just completely torn apart. And then he ended up leaving the area.
How did he get away from this creature? Was there any explanation of that?
No, just when it slammed him into the wall, it knocked him out, and apparently maybe the creature thought he was dead or whatever. We don't know.
Hmm. Wow. And what state was that in?
That was in Texas.
Also in Texas.
Yeah,
Sounds like they
just
grow them vicious down there.
well, they're kind of like that all over, really. I can tell you a story from Missouri. A lady we've interviewed several times, and I keep in close contact with her because she's got a bad situation there. She told us now her own things that happened were bad enough, but she said one of the neighbors, and it's a small community in southern Missouri, one of the ladies who lives near her, older lady, come walking over, and she told her this story during a conversation about um, walking near that spot between their homes and got hit on the side of her head from the back and knocked out. When she woke up, one of these creatures was there, uh, squatted down over her. So she kind of passed out again. And when she woke up again, the thing had opened her midsection, was eating her small intestines in front of her. And I've interviewed thousands of people over the years, and I thought I'd heard everything. I'm sitting here with my mouth open, listening to this conversation she's telling us about. And apparently, another neighbor came by with his dog, scared the creature off. They took her to the hospital. Now, it had just started eating, so apparently it didn't do a huge amount of damage, but they took her to the hospital, and she told us, this lady Carol, she showed her the scars and everything, so she knew that it actually happened. Um, but the creatures there, they've with Carol, her mother, she doesn't drive, but she has her mother's car. They've urinated on the car a couple of times to apparently locate it. I have pictures of that. And it's a scary situation. So, we hear these things from all over the place. These aren't isolated incidents. That's why I wrote my book and I called it the Bigfoot Survival Guide.
Well, what else have you discovered that was, because I don't get very many interviews where people have had this type of an encounter. Maybe they just don't talk about it so much, but usually it's more of just a real brief sighting at somewhat of a distance, and Bigfoot just takes off, goes somewhere else. But yeah, the survival book, what else have you advised people, and what other stories have you heard?
Oh boy. I'm trying to think of some good ones. There's so many. A lot of times, well, I tell people, well, for advice, first of all, of course, is never to go alone. If you're going to be someplace, don't go alone. One of my friends who's also an ex-policeman in Southern Washington, we had just had a conversation a couple of days before this incident happened. He, I told him, I said, well, number one, don't be alone. Secondly, um, you know, one of the things we know is that uh, if if they don't know, if the creatures don't know how many people there are in a group, it kind of throws them off. So I said, what you want to do is if you have a situation happen, talk out loud like you're talking to other people, and it kind of throws them off their game. So he and two of his buddies, also ex-policemen, were hunting elk in southern Washington a few years ago, and he didn't know the other two guys decided to move farther away, quite a bit farther away. So he's in his deer stand and he's thinking that he's bored. He's waiting for the elk weren't moving fast enough for him. So he gets his elk call out and then he starts hearing weird sounds from different directions. I mean, some bizarre sounds. So pretty soon, and he's getting nervous. So he gets down out of the deer stand and then these five of these creatures come rushing in at him from different directions. And he remembered what I told him. He started talking out loud like he was talking to his buddies. And he was able to make it to his truck about 100 feet away and get out of there. But it scared him pretty bad. He never went back hunting in the area.
Well, yeah, I think oftentimes it can be a frightening thing whether they attack you or not. But goodness, that woman that ended up having to go to the hospital and having a Bigfoot attack her was that would just be an unreal story. And was this right outside her home, or was this wasn't even in a remote area, right?
No, it's a small community. I can't remember the name of the town, but very small population. And it happened between her home and the other woman's home. And I'm not sure how far apart. There's a little space between them, probably a couple, 200, 300 yards, but it happened between those two places. And then she's had plenty of other encounters. One of the creatures got into her house one night, and it must have been a smaller one because they're massive. The ones I saw, the first one I saw, well, actually, second sighting was a bigger one, but the first time, that creature I was 16, so I was probably about 5'9" at the time or so, and this creature was a good 2 feet above me, so it was around 8 feet tall, 4 or 5 feet across the shoulders, from front to back, a good 3 feet. The head shorter, but it's the same. I mean, they're really big. So I can only imagine what she was. Her mother was sick, and she was staying with her at the time. She had a little um, one room trailer. Her mom was staying in the bedroom. She was sleeping on the floor in the hallway to keep tabs on her mom, listen to her breathing and things like that. And then one of the creatures actually stuck in the front door. And she said, she was really full. She heard it there for a bit. It was apparently listening, and it left. But that's got to be scary. I can't imagine getting into your house like that. They will manipulate. They can grab a doorknob. They will manipulate it until they can actually open it.
So what else can you tell me? What from your books or just from your research or even from the interviews you've done? What is the wisdom that you can share with us?
Well, lots of people think these creatures are just some bumbling ape out there. They're not. They're an apex predator, and that's how you have to approach this. All primates are the smartest creatures on the planet. I know people like to lump dogs and dolphins and things like that close to us. They're nowhere near. There's a gulf of difference in intelligence between a primate, and that's all primates, whether it's humans, chimps, gorillas, monkeys, whatever, and any other animal species. There's a huge difference. So these things are probably, um, for a non-human primate, they're pretty close to us in terms of intelligence. I mean, um, they've been seen in behaviorally almost, they can move almost like in military fashion. But then, I've seen videos of chimps hunting monkeys. They do very similar kinds of things. So, um, but that's something to bear in mind. They're never alone. If you see one, there's always a group. Um, so there are others nearby. You'd never want to shoot one because you don't have to deal with just that one. You got to deal with these buddies too. Um, they have short fuses. Lots of primates are actually very aggressive. Our anthropologist Forrest, um, in Texas, she used to study chimps, and she said, like the chimps you see on TV, those are highly trained to be, comical and friendly. In the wild, they're not like that at all. They're actually very aggressive, and they've been known to. In fact, she cited one example where somebody worked with a chimp. The animal tore her face off. So this happens very quickly. This kind of behavior. So Sasquatches are the same way. I used to know a researcher in the southeastern part of the country, and he told me about a small town there, where apparently one or more of the creatures were just doing vindictive things, and we don't know what precipitated the behavior, but it's not an isolated situation where these things were just going out killing, not just wildlife but domestic animals indiscriminately. They weren't eating them even. They would. One example was a horse. They bit through its spine and its neck and killed it. Just left it. So I have, native friends in Alaska who talk about um, the creatures up there. Very bad behavior. In fact, there was one small village on the western part of Alaska last year that had to be evacuated. They took all the women and children and sent them off, 50 miles or more to different villages temporarily because the creatures were bold. They come right up in the daytime, a group of them were, and would challenge the men of the village. So they're not something that's warm and fuzzy. They're not forced people. They're something to be respected. I treat it like a grizzly. Don't mess with them.
Yeah, it sounds like good advice if you're in a situation that. So, what do you think about this? 411 missing 411, where they're suspected that Bigfoot is stealing women and children and hikers and all kinds of people in national forest, and they're just poof gone.
Well, I don't think much of the missing 411 stuff, but I won't get into that. It's kind of tainted that stuff. However, on taking people, yes, they do. And there's some of this I can't really go into. I mean, I have contacts that will just say inside contacts. Uh, One of them is part of a kill team where they go after the bad ones that are doing stuff like that. And some of the stuff is pretty grisly, I get told, where they've eaten people, and they know they have because they've killed these individuals and cut them open to see what they've been eating, and I've had very graphic descriptions of the contents told to me. So um, that's why I tell people never go alone and treat this like an apex predator that they are, because now humans aren't, on their primary diet, but they're going to be opportunistic. And I've got a good friend of mine I've known for 50 years that, he likes to go hiking alone, and I tell him don't do that. Don't ever go alone.
Yeah, good advice also, for sure. So, so you have been researching this for an extended period of time. Probably, what's the most interesting or problematic issue you've run into in all of your research?
Well, it's interesting. I guess we were in the field in Central Oregon last not last summer, summer before last. We spent a couple of years in this one area, um, very active area. Buddy of mine in Eugene, he kind of put us onto it from his hunting friends. And coincidentally, it's also in a county with one of the highest missing people numbers in the country. So that got my attention. So we went there with the team, and we were trying out some new equipment. So I went and bought a really high end parabolic mic, and we weren't familiar with it. But one of the guys on the team, well, two of the guys are tech guys, so we were out setting this stuff up, and we you stay out of their hunting areas when they're there. That's the best way to stay safe when you're in these areas, and you can observe things better. And their hunting times are usually plus or minus an hour of sunset, the same for sunrise. And mainly that's because that's when the game animals are moving. You know, the deer coming down out of the bedding areas to their feeding areas right at dusk, and then in the morning they're heading back to their bedding areas. So that's when their predators are going to be following them. In fact, I kind of demonstrated that to the guys one evening. Um, we were talking about airflow and where scents are and things like that, how scent moves through the air. And then right where I pointed, here comes three deer popping out of the brush. And I said, okay, we need to leave because the creatures are going to be not far behind them or adjacent to them. And then it wasn't long after that we started hearing these vocalizations. And the creatures were um, apparently they were hunting this group of deer from different areas, and they were vocalizing, coordinating back and forth, and kind of put us on edge a little bit. We had to get out of there. So there were interesting things. We could, we recorded things and that were going on, and then left the area because you want to leave them alone. If you want an extended situation to go on, you don't bother them, like we did with the alcohol thing. That's why it lasted so long there, 9 months. But one of the times we went really up high in the country, and that's the Three Sisters Wilderness area. So we went, oh geez, I don't know what the elevation was up there, but um, we were really too high up because creatures that, like I said, had gone down to the feeding areas, and we didn't hear anything. So we went down to the valley that we were in, and and it was funny. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, and I just didn't feel like going back to the hotel yet. And I said, well, let's stop and set everything up again, and we'll sit around and listen for a while. So we pulled off to this spur road before we got to the river, and we didn't get. Thank God, my buddy Adam on the team, he's a Hollywood special effects guy. In fact, he's made our first film and working on the second one. But he did everything, had everything, all these redundant systems going at the same time. So we had pulled into this place, shut everything down, no lights, and Dave was setting up the parabolic mic, and we found out it didn't work because one of the batteries was bad. But that's a reason for thanking that Adam, or thank goodness Adam was there with these redundant systems, because maybe 65 yards out in front of us now, there's no roads, no trails, no nothing out there. This was out in the middle of absolute uh, or near inaccessible area in front of us by humans. We heard logs being thrown around out there really loud. And we're like, what the heck is that? And thank goodness we got it all recorded. And I've actually anything that legitimate that happens behaviorally, you can go back. And a lot of people today, they don't like the historical accounts for some reason, but you can find parallels. I mean, if there's a living creature out there, it's going to do similar things over geography and time. And you can pick out these parallels. And I've read our old articles where people have heard this very similar kind of thing before. What they're doing, we have no idea, but um, there are things that just sort of make you go, that was crazy. What were they doing out there?
Mhm. Yeah, I hear that a lot too, interviewing people from all across the country, and there will be, many similarities between experiences, sounds, behavior. It's very natural to them, I suppose.
Right, right.
Well, anything else you can tell us before we end the interview today?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I've talked to people for 8, 9 hours straight, so it just it all depends, and where a conversation goes.
Exactly. Well, I'm still stuck on this woman being eaten in her yard. So that one is
That's
just, that's a new one and one that I would like to explore more, the dangers that are out there.
oh
I think we can get lulled into an idea that because the sightings are brief and not invasive to a human being, we can sometimes believe that this is a not so dangerous predator. But I like the way you brought it up, very close and personal here, of how this thing can get in houses and attack people and possibly even take people. And so that's another angle and another area to absolutely research and make sure that people are safe out there.
I think most people have the wrong idea about this topic. They get into it, and there especially people who call themselves, quote unquote experts. And I've done this. I just had my 51st anniversary being involved in this from the time we found those footprints. So having the vantage point of done this for a very long time and been connected to, the top people in the topic, I have a little different perspective than most people, I think. So, and from seeing things that people think and things that I know and things I've been told, um, this is not, it's not a game for the faint of heart. We'll put it that way.
Absolutely. It's a risky research project for a lot of people
Very
out there
much so.
in the wild.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
I
well,
had a guy.
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I had a friend of mine from Indiana who was he was our resident skeptic. And I love people that are skeptical. That's my favorite person out there because they're the people that ask good questions. But him and his son went out to an area where there had been some reported activity, and they actually had a very frightening encounter, and he completely changed his point of view. So, and he found out very quickly they're not our forest friends.